My clock is 1 in Helsinki now, so I will slowly get started since we have an hour and a half prepared for this webinar, and I think we have quite a lot of things to go through. And we of course want you to have the possibility to ask questions and comment. But I guess now it's the time to warmly welcome you all for our webinar with the topic of CO2 logistics and infrastructure in the context of Finland. And it is a huge pleasure to see so many of you interested in this topic. I think we had around 300 people who signed up for this webinar. So it seems that people are very interested in this theme, which is of course music to my ears and for many others as well, I hope. But before we get started and before I even introduce myself, I will go through a couple of basic housekeeping rules, since we are quite a big number of people today here online. So I would ask you to please keep your microphones muted and also your cameras off in case you're not speaking. And you can use the chat function to write comments and ask questions. And if you wish to speak, we have time prepared for the questions and comments also in the program. But if you wish to speak, then I would ask you to raise your hand so that we can give you a permission to go ahead. And just so you know, this webinar is being recorded, and we will share the recording after the session in the beginning of next week. And all of the materials will be shared afterward as well. So here are all the basics, so everyone doesn't have to ask the same questions in the chat. But now that we have gone through these rules for the actual session, here you can see the webinar program. So nice to meet you all. I'm Erika Lailahti from the Bioenergy Association of Finland, and I'm our sector manager in carbon removal and CCUS. And I will be giving you a short introduction, setting the scene on the topic of industrial carbon management and why we are interested in infrastructure and logistics. And then we'll dive into the actual interesting part of today. So going through our report and our experts from VTT, so Onni Linjala and Lauri Kujanpää, who have been in charge of making this report that we are publishing today, will share you the insights and key findings. And after this presentation, we will have questions and answers because I think some people might have specific questions on your presentation. And then after that, we'll go through our commentaries from our steering group, and we'll have Pinja Salhoja from Tampere Energy and Elina Mäki from Gas Grid Hydrogen Grids, giving their point of view to the work conducted in this project. Oh, and then at the end, we will have a time for questions and answers and discussion and closing remarks, and we will end the webinar at 2:30 Finnish time. I think we have our basics now pretty much straight. So I will kick off the actual program. But just before I go into the actual topic, I would just like to tell you a little bit about our association, very shortly, I promise. But I figured that all of you might not be so familiar with us. So here you go. Here's the little group that is working in in the Bioenergy Association of Finland, and we are a business association with 250 member organizations, and we do advocacy and events, and we represent the entire bioenergy sector. And to put it very short, our goal is to make Finland the best place in the world to create sustainable bio-based and even carbon negative solutions, which is, of course, also then very much interlinked with today's topic. And we have a special carbon removal and CCUS committee and a separate biochar network helping us in this work. And we are actually currently updating our website and improving our English site. So I hope you find it useful if these topics are of your interest. But now I think I've done enough of the introduction of who I am and where I'm coming from. And I will very shortly try to give you a bit of an overview of why we are talking about CO2 logistics and infrastructure today. Just a disclaimer, I know that there are many things that should be said when talking about this topic, and I will go very briefly past these slides since we are limited in terms of time, but I think there are a couple of things that need to be understood in terms of the key drivers and what is going on the regulatory side of the development. But since we are from Finland, the presenters, and our study today is focusing on the Finnish context, I think that I have to start from the Finnish context and then move forward to the EU level. And today I will unfortunately not have time to go to the global level, but let's start here. So Finland has a national climate target of being carbon neutral by 2035. It's in law. And here you can see a picture from our annual climate report that was published in June. And you can see how we have been doing in the past years. And there are good news and bad news. We have been doing quite nicely in the emissions reduction side. So last year, our emissions went down by 11% from the previous year. So quite good development on that side. However, we do face difficulty in the other side of the puzzle, so especially in the land use sector and especially on the sink side. And there is currently an estimated need to find more actions in all sectors to reach to reduce emissions by 19 million tons in order to reach the 2035 target. So it's a big target and tall order if we want to reach that kind of numbers in just 10 years. But we have some good news, and there's a quote from our Minister of Climate and Environment, Kai Mykkänen, who commented on this report in June and pointed out that we have actually a very nice opportunities in terms of scale actions and actions that bring these emissions down or sink up in scale, hopefully fast enough. And here, carbon capture is a very interesting topic, and we are currently developing incentives for that nationally. Now I look at the time and I move forward to the EU level. So of course, if we think about CCUS, carbon capture, utilization and storage solutions, our clear drivers are also the EU level climate targets. Here you can see a lot of information in these two pictures that are from the Commission's communications that were published in February this year. On the left-hand side, there is the trajectory of the need for our emissions reductions and sinks to develop in order to reach the 2030, 2040, and 2050 climate targets. 2040, of course, it's not yet in law, but the Commission proposed that the EU should be going for a net 90% emission reduction target. And one clear message with these communications was that there is no scenario where EU will reach its climate targets without major scale up of carbon capture, utilization and storage. So we need it. And then on the other picture, you can see a bit of the of how the solutions between storage and utilization vary in the coming decades. So as you see on the top bars in blue, there's the share of storage and share of utilization in the lighter blue in the coming decades. So first, somebody has a problem, but I hope most of you can see this presentation. So the share of storage and share of utilization ramping up in the 2040s, 2050s, and the sources where the captured CO2 is coming from. But what the Commission said is that what is the priority now in order to get to this massive scale? And that is CO2 infrastructure and storage capacity. So, so the Commission has pointed out that we will need carbon capture and storage, carbon capture and utilization, and carbon removals, industrial carbon removals. And all of these pathways rely on CO2 infrastructure. So it's kind of a good news. These systems can help to scale up all of these pathways. And it is quite clear that we, especially in Finland, we have projects in the development where the CO2 is captured and then it's utilized very close to the capture facility. But this is not the case for all projects. And actually, when we move forward and scale, it is very likely that it cannot be the case in many projects. And we will need to transport the CO2 for use or for storage. And the end game would be to have a common CO2 market at the EU level. And of course, that means common CO2 infrastructure. And of course, already today, CO2 is transported, but the volumes are very much smaller than what the volumes, if you look at the numbers, we're talking about tens, hundreds of millions of tons of CO2 that needs to be transported, used or stored. We will need new solutions in the transport side. And we already have quite a few pieces of legislation that deal with CO2 transport and infrastructure, but we do not have sufficient legislation for cross-border open access multimodal CO2 transport. And the Commission knows this, and these are the key actions pointed out in the industrial carbon management strategy on transport and infrastructure. So what is happening now in the short term? Of course, there is a clear need for the CO2 transport regulatory package that needs to address several issues. There's a few lined in the slide. On top of this, we will need an EU-wide CO2 transport infrastructure planning mechanism. What kind of mechanism this will be, we don't know yet, but it's quite clear that we have issues such as repurposing existing infrastructure for CO2 or for other gases. And this is something that we need to plan together. And also, when we are planning these networks, stakeholder input is vital. We don't make any plans for infrastructure if we don't know that somebody needs it, and we need to know. So that is, of course, an important part of this planning. Commission is considering of nominating European coordinators for the development of cross-border infrastructure, and also developing emissions accounting under the ETS for all transport modes. And of course, if we're talking about a common infrastructure, shared infrastructure, we will need to have certain standards for the CO2 streams. And this is something that the Commission is also working on together with the European standardization bodies. And if we're talking about CO2 transport, I think if we would have talked about it 15 years ago, we would have been talking about pipelines. But it's quite clear now that we will need other modes of transport, and ship transport being one of the important ones. And here, safe CO2 transport by sea and necessary guidelines for that are essential in order to get to the scale. Well, what have we seen so far? What has the development looked like? Well, it's quite promising, at least from where I'm looking at. We have seen several CO2 infrastructure or CO2 hubs forming in different parts of the EU, and we have seen great progress also in the CO2 infrastructure actually being built and being there to actually do its job. And here's a picture of the Northern Lights project that just last week had an opening ceremony in Oygarden to celebrate the completion of their CO2 receiving facility. So this is, of course, essential if we think about the scaling up of all of these pathways, storage and utilization, as the infrastructure is pretty much the same in many ways for both value chains. So seeing this infrastructure there up and running, it's good, important proof that this is something that we can do, and it's possible, technically feasible, and done within the expected timeline and budget. But of course, we will need these EU guidelines to further support the investments in these projects. Now I'm looking at the time, and I know that I should let our guys from the actual report talk more. So I will not go into the details of the next slides, just pointing out for your interest that, for example, this report by the Joint Research Centre that was published in February alongside with the communications mentioned earlier, gives an overview of the future CO2 transport network planning for Europe. And this is under an update currently. For example, there will be inclusion of identification and clustering of CO2 ports, terminals, and hubs to get a bit of a better picture of the network, including other modes than pipelines. But here, I would say that Finnish stakeholders should really pay attention that they are vocal enough of their plans, as we do have plans that are further in the development to get these plans into the EU level planning as well. And here you will get these materials, but this was just to point out that these are the projects of common interest and projects of mutual interest. across EU. And we have 14 of these. So these projects include at least 2 member states that are planning CO2 network together. So it's good to point out. Okay, so I got muted, but I will stop soon, so please don't mute me again. There are projects in many places around EU and neighboring countries, so it's not just the countries that are in the headlines, but we do have a lot of development all the way from the Baltics to the Mediterranean regarding CO2 networks. So it's just good to keep in mind. But now I've talked enough and hopefully given you a bit of an introduction to the topic. And now I will let Lauri and Onni take the lead and talk about this topic of infrastructure and logistics in the Finnish context. And yeah, tell us about the insights.
Yes, thank you very much, Erika, for the introduction. And hello all, my name is Onni Linjala. I'm a research scientist here at VTT, and together with my colleague and team leader, Lauri, we will be presenting our results from the study on outlook of CO2 logistics in Finland for CCUS. And it's great to see so many of you here today on this webinar. Just briefly introducing to the subject, as Erika mentioned, logistics is a crucial part of CCUS value chains. So if we're capturing CO2 and we cannot store it or utilize it at the site of capture, we need to transport it to a suitable location using pipelines, ships, trains, or trucks. And this is especially... Excuse me, somebody has their microphone open. Could you please mute yourself? Thank you. And this CO2 logistic is especially important for these CO2 storage value chains, where the storage sites are typically quite far away from the actual sites of capture. As you can see from the figure on the right, it typically needs quite a large transport infrastructure from the actual capture site to the end use site. And it's also a lot more than just pipelines and ships. It also requires other infrastructure like these CO2 receiving terminals that you can see on the bottom figure from the Northern Lights project. And why are we doing these studies? Because we believe that shared logistic infrastructure, it can reduce costs for all parties due to economies of scale benefits, and it can also encourage other parties to participate into CCUS due to better accessibility and reduced investment risks. And as Erika mentioned, it's also an important part of the industrial carbon management strategy that aims to set the required policy framework for scaling up CO2 logistics and CCUS value chains. Now, this is especially important for here us in Finland. As you can see from the figure, it presents the potential CO2 storage reservoirs in Europe. And as you can see, there aren't storage reservoirs in Finland. That is because the Finnish bedrock is not suitable for geological storage of CO2. We of course have the possibility for CO2 mineralization, but that is not yet as mature as geological storage of CO2. However, there are quite a lot of transport and storage projects in Europe, around 19 in preparation, maybe more now. And currently the most promising potential, or at least the most advanced projects, lie in the North Sea region, for instance, the Northern Lights project and the Danish Greensand project. We can also expect that the storage capacity will increase. We have the EU's Net Zero Industry Act, which has a target of annual CO2 injection capacity of 50 million tons in the EU by 2030. And it also requires obligations for the member states to map these storage areas and oil and gas companies to develop the storage infrastructure. Now, when we think about the actual value chains, they can be actually a bit more complex than you would think in the first place. So here's a potential value chain for a CO2 transport, for instance, from Finland to a storage site in the North Sea. So we have the actual carbon capture site, and from there we have to transport the CO2 maybe to an intermediate storage terminal near the harbor, from where we are transporting the CO2 maybe to another terminal near the actual storage sites. And from there we again use either ships or pipelines to transport the CO2 to the final storage site. So it can involve quite a lot of stages actually, the CO2 transport value chain. Now, if you wish to familiarize yourself with our previous studies on CO2 logistics, here's a brief listing. So these studies go all the way back 15 years ago from now, starting from the CCS Finland project and also in the quite large CCSP project, and then a couple of more recent studies on CO2 use and removal and technological carbon sinks in Finland, which also looked into CO2 logistics a bit. But now to the actual study that we're here discussing today. In this study, we aim to assess the potential transport options and CO2 transport network designs for CO2 logistics in Finland. We also aim to evaluate the actual transport costs and the size of investment required for this infrastructure. This included that we reviewed industrial CO2 point sources in Finland and also existing transport infrastructure, and then identified potential CO2 hubs in Finland. Then based on this data, we designed some CO2 logistic development scenarios and calculated the transport costs and also the required investments for these scenarios. Now going into more detail in the actual methodology and results of the study. First, we looked into the industrial CO2 emissions in Finland. That was mainly the data was mainly collected from the European Pollutant and Release and Transfer Register, which includes industrial facilities with annual emissions of over 100 kilotons. And from all the 72 facilities that we examined, they totaled for around 45 million tons of CO2 in 2022. And 30 megatons or 66% of this CO2 was biogenic. So majority of the CO2 from industrial CO2 emissions in Finland are biogenic. That is mainly because of the strong role of forest industry in Finland and because of the significant role of bioenergy production here in Finland. As you can see from the forest industry, there's roughly around 20 megatons of CO2, biogenic CO2 available, and from thermal power stations like combined heat and power plants and other combustion installations, there's roughly around 9 million tons of biogenic CO2. This is of course only from the large facilities. There are also facilities that do not reach the scale of 100 kilotons per annum, but these are from the large CO2 point sources in Finland. Based on these emission data, we also wanted to examine the seasonal variation of these CO2 point sources, because we have for instance district heating plants where the seasonal load varies. So in the winter they are in the larger capacity, and during the summer when district heating is not needed, they are on lower capacity. And we examined these because it also affects the dimensioning of the logistics infrastructure. So it has to be dimensioned for the maximum output of CO2, if that is the amount of CO2 that we want to transport from each location during that time. But from the 72 facilities, we identified that there were 23 district heating CHP plants that are prone to seasonal load changes, and together with the district heating operators, we came up with these assumptions for seasonal variation of these plants. So during the coldest winter months, they're assumed to be running at 100% capacity. Then in the spring and autumn months, it's from 40 to 70%, and we assume that during the summer months, it's at zero. Of course, there's variation between the facilities, but these were the assumptions used for this study. Now, in addition to the emission data, we also mapped out the existing transport infrastructure in Finland, then the currently announced plans for CO2 utilization in Finland, and also CO2 storage potential via mineralization. And here on this figure, you can see all these data mapped out in Finland. So the green and gray balls, they illustrate the biogenic CO2 sources and fossil CO2 sources. Then the blue circles, they illustrate storage potential via mineralization, and then the pink circles, they are the CO2 utilization projects. Then there's the railway network in orange, and also we have harbors and merchant waterways mapped in this map. And this was used as a basis for our designs of transport scenarios. And as you can see, there are large CO2 point sources scattered quite evenly within Finland, excluding the northernmost Lapland region. And we can also see that most of these CO2 point sources are reached by the existing railway network. Then the utilization projects, there was 13 of them, and currently they total only for around 1.3 megatons of CO2 per year if they all would be realized. And of course, there can be more utilization projects coming up as well. But we can see that these projects are largely located near already existing CO2 point sources from where CO2 could be supplied to these projects if carbon capture would be implemented in these projects. Then the potential sites for mineralization, they're mainly located at central and northern parts of Finland. So they're basically mines where there's mining waste available where we could possibly bounce CO2 to. And some of these sites are neither near existing CO2 point sources nor railways, meaning that there would be need for trucks or pipelines to reach these areas if CO2 storage in these sites would be desired. Now, based on this data, we identified 9 potential CO2 hubs that were studied in these scenarios, and they were created from regions with significant CO2 emission point sources within a reasonable distance from each other. And here on the table, you can see all these hubs that were identified and what is the total capacity of the facilities in that hub, with an assumed 90% carbon capture rate. And you can also see what is the share of biogenic CO2 in that hub. So there's hubs ranging from 1 million tons even up to around 6 million tons of CO2 per annum. And these were used as a basis for our scenario development. So we developed these logistic scenarios to study how we could implement CO2 logistics in Finland based on these identified hubs. And in this scenario work, we designated each hub either to storage or utilization in total, meaning that in storage hubs, all the CO2 within the hub is transported to a nearest harbor for further shipping to a storage site in the North Sea. Then in utilization hubs, we assume that all the CO2 is transported to one key location within the hub for centralized utilization, which typically was chosen to be the largest CO2 point source in that hub to minimize the transport demands. All these designs for the hubs and also for the transport routes were designed manually, and we roughly followed the guidelines that railways are utilized if they are en route. Then we tried to minimize the transport distance and transported CO2 amount, and we also prioritized coastal hubs for CO2 storage that need ship export to reduce the transport demands from inland locations to shores. And here on the figure you can see an example on the Pirkanmaa utilization hub and how the routing was done there. So basically the CO2 is transported from the facilities to a central location in Tampere for centralized utilization. And first, we came up with these three primary scenarios that consist of regional hubs with shared infrastructure, but the hubs are separated from the other hubs. So they have shared infrastructure within the hub, but they're not connected to each other. And as I mentioned, they are designated either to storage or utilization in full, but the capacities between these scenarios were altered. First, we had the scenario A, which aims to supply balanced amount of CO2 both to storage and utilization, around 12 to 13 million tons per annum. Then in scenario B, the utilization capacity was ramped up, whereas storage capacity was reduced in similar proportion. And then in scenario C, we emphasized storage, so storage capacity is now at 18 million tons and utilization capacity is at 7 million tons. Then, in addition to these scenarios, we also investigated these trunk line scenarios where we had extended coverage for the transport network by connecting these key hubs to each other. In the trunk line 1 scenario, we basically connected the hubs identified in the previous scenarios to examine how costly would CO2 transport be within these trunk lines. Then in the more extended trunk line scenario 2, we decided to further expand the coverage of the trunk lines to include all possible facilities or nearly all possible facilities within the transport network. And these scenarios also gave us some additional indication on the cost between different transport modes. We were able to compare pipeline cost to train costs using these trunk lines. And you can see from the capacities that are in these trunk lines, they range from, in the trunk line 1 scenario, from around 7 million tons up to 10 million tons, and in the trunk line 2 scenario, there's also a bit more variation. There's the 5.5 megaton trunk line in the Pohjanmaa region, and then the central trunk line from Jyväskylä up to Helsinki and Porvoo. It's roughly 12 megatons of CO2. So these were the scenarios that were studied for the transport costs and investment costs. And now I will hand the floor to Lauri, who will discuss more about the actual costs and other conclusions.
All right, thank you, Onni.
Just a second, Lauri. I see there are a couple of hands raised, and I think that if they are questions for Onni from what we just heard, then I would like to take the questions here. But in case it's a comment or something else, let's leave those for later. So I'm seeing Kjell's hand. Kjell Sandström.
Yes, thank you. I actually have a question to Onni. Did you also consider some sort of let's say, feedback loop from, let's say, CCU projects. It's a bit of a dilemma that if you add an electrolyzer next to a district heating plant, take the CO2 from the stack, then you all of a sudden have from the, let's say, electrolyzer a very good heat source for district heating, which would lower the CO2 production. So you have these kind of feedbacks when you introduce these kind of projects. And the other thing is that in district heating, there is a lot of electric boiler coming, heat pumps coming, and also in the industry, a lot of like lignin utilization that will like lower the biogenic CO2, or at least have an effect on the CO2 production. So have you considered this kind of influence in any way?
Yeah, that is an excellent question. But in this study, we did not investigate these synergies between hydrogen production and other possible impacts. These are mainly from the current CO2 point sources. But of course, we would have to take account these other synergies with hydrogen production and these utilization projects. But unfortunately, in this study, it was out of the scope of this study.
Yeah, it would be a very interesting thing because the storage part would be quite expensive for Finland when we have to ship it quite a long way to store it. So it would be better if we could just utilize everything and have that feedback working for our benefits.
Definitely.
Thank you. I think now we move forward since we have this timeline. So go ahead, Lauri.
Okay, thanks. And just a small addition to Onni's answer, which I totally agree with, is that the scope of the study was just to study at the transport infrastructure, and we didn't go into creating the work as a some sort of prognosis of how the system should develop and will develop. So we are just looking at what the plans are now, what are the emission sources now, and what the transport infrastructure might look like in that case. But yes, very valid points. And of course, we do not know how the CO2 emissions evolve in the future, and we have not taken this into account in this study at all, although we are very aware of it. Thanks for the question. So my name is Lauri Kujampa. I'm a research team leader at VTT and working on the field of CCUS since the first of the studies that Onni showed in one of the first slides. I'm very happy to be here telling about the results on my part. Let me share the here. If I move it here, then I'm looking more at the camera. So yes, Onni presented the CO2 emissions, the logistic system, the planning of how the system might look like, and the capacities. And my part of the presentation focuses on what would it cost, the results of the transport cost modeling. Let's start with the scope of the transport cost model. We start at the capture facility, where we have the compression and liquefaction of CO2. We exclude the CO2 capture from the costs here. And we liquefy the CO2 in case it's transported by trains or trucks or ships. And there's always an intermediate storage before the rail, truck, or ship transport segment begins. After the compression or liquefaction, we look at the look at the different transport options to forward the CO2. And as Onni already explained, we are relying on the rail transportation in the scenarios as much as possible if the infrastructure is existing. And the utilization of the CO2, in case of utilization, we are assuming that there is a buffer storage of CO2 at the destination where the utilization takes place, and the size of the buffer storage is worth of 1 week of CO2 transport capacity. But we exclude any costs related to utilization from the transport costs. If the CO2 is transported to geological storage, then the CO2 is transported to the nearest harbor, or the harbor which is selected within each emission hub. And there we have liquefaction if the CO2 is transported there by pipelines. If the CO2 comes with a train or a truck to the harbor, then we do not have no more liquefaction at the harbor, but we have, in any case, liquid CO2 buffer storage, which has a capacity of 1.5 times the capacity of a single CO2 carrying ship. And the transport distances, the shipping transport distances are based on assumed distances to the North Sea region, and when the CO2 arrives at the receiving terminal in the North Sea region, we assume that the CO2 is offloaded, and there's a buffer storage also for the CO2. Any other costs related to forwarding the CO2 into the actual storage reservoir, or injecting the CO2 into the storage, or any monitoring and verification requirements and so forth are not included. So we also exclude the storage costs from the study. We are just looking at the transport part of the CCUS chain. All the distances that are modeled are based on straight line distances between points, and we assume just a factor of 1.2 to come up with the actual kilometers between different points in inland transportations. And as I already explained, the shipping distances are based on a certain point in the North Sea region, which is same for all emission hubs, and an intermediate buffer storage is assumed in the utilization sites worth of 7 days of total average capture capacity. Economic life in the economic calculations is 20 years, and the interest rate is 5%, and we assume a price of electricity of 70 euros per megawatt hour. So looking at, as a summary, the overview of the costs in the scenarios A, B, and C, the transport costs to geological storage is of course more expensive than to utilization, and the more the scenario emphasizes on the geological storage, the more investments are needed. And the average cost to storage in these three scenarios was 45 to 52 euros per ton, and this is the average cost in the scenario. The average cost in each hub varies more, and of course the actual facility specific cost varies even more. But in this summary view, we are looking at the average costs in each scenario. Then when we are looking at the average cost to utilization, the costs are lower, and the average costs are 24 to 28 euros per ton in the scenarios. And the transport cost to geological storage is lowest in the balanced scenario A and the storage emphasized scenario C, and scenario B, which has the utilization emphasis. There the costs to transporting CO2 to geological storage are the highest of the three scenarios. I will not pour all the numbers on the table here, but as an example, here are more detailed cost results for scenario A. And if we are looking at the column on the far right, we can see the average transport costs for each hub in scenario A, and the first 5 hubs are hubs that are focused on transporting the CO2 to geological storage, and there the average transport costs in the hubs are between 35 to 56 euros per ton. And I remind again that the facility specific costs have a higher range or wider range. Then the last 4 hubs are focused on utilization of CO2, and there the average transport costs are between 22 to 37 euros per ton in the hubs. And the investments in the total investments for transporting CO2 to storage is 2.9 billion, and the total investments for transporting the CO2 to utilization is 1.4 billion euros in this case A scenario. Comparing all 5 scenarios A, B, and C, and then the 2 trunk line scenarios, which studied the interconnections between the emission hubs to transport CO2 into geological storage, and putting them into order of how much CO2 is transported into storage, we can see that the cost is highest in the utilization scenario B, and the amount stored is lowest also. The lowest average scenario average costs are reached in scenario C, where we transport a bit less than 20 million tons of CO2 into storage. When we expand the network furthermore to include more CO2 emission sources, we end up actually increasing the transport costs in this case that we present here. But by increasing the transport costs somewhat, we can gain a considerable increase in the amount of CO2 transported to geological storage. So there's a bit of a trade-off in that comes with the 2 trunk line scenarios in the form that we have designed them. We are not saying that they are the actual optimum network solutions, but as an examples, you can see the trade-off between expanding the infrastructure and the average CO2 transport costs to storage. So let's move on to the key takeaways of the results. First of all, as only presented, we can show that there is a number of emission hubs which can provide over 25 million tons of CO2 for utilization or storage in Finland, and the share of biogenic emissions is in our presented hubs more than 20 million tons per year. And this biogenic CO2 potential is higher than the current plant utilization capacity or the mineralization potential in Finland. So we have a lot of CO2 and there's enough for both utilization and storage options. The hubs offer theoretically quite a good approach, a balance between reaching these high utilization and storage capacities while minimizing the requirement to transport the CO2. So it's a quite good option to focus the storage-oriented capture sites at the coastal regions and utilization of CO2 into inland emission hubs in theory. The capital region has a high seasonal variation within the emission sources, and this increased the transport costs in the capital region compared to other places in Finland. When we are looking at assuming to use as much the existing rail transport infrastructure, the average costs to transporting CO2 to utilization in the scenarios A, B, and C was between 20 and 33 euros per ton in the hubs, and transport costs to storage in the hubs were between 35 to 59 euros per ton. And this includes the compression and liquefaction and buffer storage at the destination. And the investment costs within the scenarios A, B, and C was between 3.7 to 4.7 billion euros based on our calculations. And the investments were lower in the utilization heavy scenario. Ship and pipeline transport costs are very they depend strongly on the capacity of the transport connection. So that's why this is one indication why shared infrastructure is useful, and we can see from the results that it's at least 2 to 4 million tons of CO2 should be collected at the harbor for transport into the geological storage. This would allow to get the benefits from the economies of scale. And looking at the graph here, we can see that the liquefaction costs and the intermediate buffer costs and investments are very important for shipping transport costs, and the uncertainties within the costs are very much related to all the indirect fixed costs and contingencies and costs related to these site-specific larger unit investments. The lines presented here in this graph show that when the transport capacity would be reduced to 0.5 million tons per year, the costs would increase quite significantly. And if the orange line in the bottom is showing the picture of transporting 4 million tons of CO2 over a distance of 1,000 to 2,500 kilometers. So the bars, the stacked columns that you see, they present the shipping costs of 1 million tons of CO2 over a distance of 1,000 or 1,500, 2,000 and 2,500 kilometers. It's a bit crowded graph, but I hope you can get the main message across. Finally, we investigated more what are the benefits of shared infrastructure versus independent logistic investments of capture facilities, and also is relying on the railway network a good option, or should we focus more on truck or pipeline transportation in Finland? To study this, we used the scenario A to vary the transport modes, the default transport modes between truck, rail, and pipeline transportation. And also we made the calculations assuming that there's the shared infrastructure, or all the capture facilities would invest in their own private transport logistic system. What we found out is that actually relying on the existing railway infrastructure seems quite good option in Finland. Also, pipelines are efficient way to transport CO2, but the problem with pipelines is that they require significant amounts of CO2 in each segment to be economical if the segment is longer than a few kilometers. So this is why we conclude that the existing railway infrastructure is very useful and promising option for CO2 infrastructure in Finland, and pipeline transportation is good alternative for that when needed. And part of the reason behind this is also that the CO2 needs to be liquefied in any case in our assumed transport system. Then we also looked at like I said, we studied the difference between opting for the shared infrastructure or independent transport systems. And there we noticed that in scenario A, the shared infrastructure reduced the facility specific transport costs from -2% to -73%. And on average, the costs were reduced by 30% when the capture facilities invest in the shared infrastructure. And like we showed with the trunk line scenarios, they are an option to extend the capacity of the transport system, but they come with a price premium. So the optimal amount of CO2 transported away from Finland is not the highest CO2 capture potential that we have, but it's somewhere there in the middle. The maybe final thought about the system costs is that if the CO2 transport infrastructure is shared between the capture facilities, then it's a good question that how do you allocate costs in the transport network? If you allocate the costs completely based on the capture facilities capacity and how much what is their share in the utilization of the transport network, then the facility specific costs show quite a high variance, and some of the capture facilities might not join the shared system because costs would be too big for them. So in order to realize this sort of large scale shared transport infrastructure, some sort of average transport tariff in the system might allow the expansion of the system to cover an optimum amount of capture facilities. With this, I thank you very much for your attention so far, and let's continue with the discussions.
Thank you so much, Lauri. There's a very alive conversation going on in the chat regarding the two different value chains, CCU and CCS, as is that is very traditional of these kinds of discussions. But I picked up there was a question on the total CO2 volume potential as a side stream of biogas upgrading. Have you calculated recently these potentials from the smaller point sources?
Yeah, I believe we do not have those in this study, or actually I'm quite certain, because these applications are so small that they are not reported under the European Pollutant and Release Transfer Register. I of course agree that they are excellent sources of possibly biogenic CO2 for some CCUS application, and definitely should be accounted for in evaluating these value chains and their potential.
Yeah, they are very interesting in regional utilization value chains. But maybe in this sort of 100 kiloton scale that we are showing here, that they are not large enough. We have I'm the typical biogas sites produce, I guess, up to 15 kilotons or 10 kilotons of CO2. I'm not I don't guarantee that I'm right here, but they are significantly smaller.
Yeah. Then there is a specific question on does South Savo, Mikkeli, Savonlinna, Pieksämäki fall in Savo-Karjala or Etelä-Karjala or both?
Yeah, I just opened up my map here and tried to check this. Basically, Pieksämäki is part of the Savo-Karjala hub, but there aren't any facilities from Pieksämäki in this study, because also they do not exceed the 100 kilotons of CO2 level that was studied here. And then the Savonlinna region, it is included to the trunk line 2 scenario. And then, no, actually it's involved in both the trunk line scenarios, and unfortunately Mikkeli in these scenarios is not included to these scenarios. That is, of course, we had to make some potential routing for these, and they may not be the best for all parties, but basically they gave us enough data to calculate out these transport costs and required investments. But the routing is not set in stone.
Yeah, thank you. There's also a similar question. Is there any reason that Turku is not assigned any CO2 hub, for example, Rauma or Helsinki hub?
Yeah, basically it would be included to the Rauma hub, but there is no direct railway link from the shore to the Rauma or Pori region, and basically it also could be included to the Uusimaa hub, but based on these emission point sources that we examined, there weren't that many CO2 emissions in the Turku region that we would decide to include them to these hubs, because they would bring quite large investments more to the infrastructure. But basically, yeah.
And
please
then,
continue.
yeah, and then just quickly, did you consider any option scenarios for a cross-Nordic pipeline? And I know the answer to this also, that it wasn't in the scope. We were focusing in the Finnish context, and then the export was assumed to be done by ship, as it most definitely will be in the first place in case there will be CCS projects up and running in the short term at least.
Yeah, all the export in this study was was based on shipping of CO2, and in the northern Finland there are pipeline options as well to Norway and Sweden, but we didn't go there.
Maybe next time. Now I will go to the part of the webinar, which is of course interesting as well. So as I mentioned earlier, within this project, we had several companies funding this this study, and the steering group from these companies, and now we have a couple of them here today who promised to give their comment and a point of view on this topic. And first one that I will ask to take the stage is Pinja Salhoja, business intelligence expert from Tampere Energy. Are you there, Pinja?
Yes. Hello everyone, and thank you Erika, Onni and Lauri for the presentations of the study. It was very interesting to take part in the steering group of this study, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to quickly comment on this topic. Maybe quickly, a couple words on Tampere Energia and our current situation in this carbon capturing field. Our current portfolio focuses heavily on bioenergy, combined with some electrified heating sources like the electric boilers and heat pumps. And our main business area is the district heating. And carbon capture has been on our radar for a few years now. And we've progressed from some initial concept studies to more detailed technological feasibility assessments in our facilities in the past couple of years. Currently, we have 2 ongoing projects in the development phase. One is at our waste-to-energy power plant, where the CO2 is to be used for e-methane production, so it would be a CCU project. And the other one is at our bioenergy plant in Naistenlahti, where we have been studying options for actually both the storage and the utilization of the biogenic CO2. So as an energy company, we do see value for both the CCU and the CCS. For CCU, we see the value would come through the created excess heat sources from the utilization and the synthetic fuel productions. Someone asked about the would the utilization reduce the biogenic CO2? I can comment on Tampere's side that we do have several different power plants, still also some fossil-based power plants, which then would be the ones first replaced by the excess heat. And in addition to these, we do have several bioenergy heat-only boilers, which are smaller than the 100,000 tons of CO2, which was the limit to be included in this infrastructure study. So the use of these smaller ones, yes, they might reduce if the excess heat amounts then would be larger than that, but it would not affect the capture, which would only be in our large power plants. So we do still see the high value of excess heat from these utilization cases. And then from the CCS, the storage side, we see that the value would come from the removal certificates from the permanent storage of the CO2. And we are inland location, so the storage aspect of carbon would require some more efforts in the infrastructure development than CCU. And also in this study, Tampere was marked in Pirkanmaa utilization hub. But actually, even the utilization of CO2 has quite many questions in the infrastructure side that do need to be addressed. Even though the distances are not that long in the utilization hubs than when it comes to storing the CO2 from inland. So we have made some concept studies on this, and it has become quite clear to us that when it comes to CO2 utilization, It doesn't occur in isolation. It always requires also hydrogen as a partner component in the CO2. And in Finland, we do have these plans for hydrogen networks, hydrogen development, and the current market situation does look like the hydrogen needs to be upgraded to a synthetic fuels. And this then leads to the regional optimization question of whether we should bring the hydrogen to the CO2 source or the CO2 to the hydrogen source, and how would this then be done with pipelines, with trucks, some combination of these. Very interesting question on the matter. And when it comes to the CO2 sources in Tampere, we probably face similar difficulties as many other Nordic cities with district heating. We have transitioned from fossil-based system to now highly bio-based system, where we do have a sustainably sourced biogenic CO2 coming from point sources. However, the infrastructure challenges come from the seasonality of the CO2 and the site requirements for the intermediate storage and the utilization facilities. For example, our biggest bioenergy power plant produces about 400,000 tons of CO2 annually, but it's down for 3 months in the summertime when the district heating demand is so low, which then causes issues with the synthetic fuel production aspects of not having constant flow of CO2. And this is a common problem in the district heating and energy production cases. But also the other issue was that the site requirements. So, for example, utilization of CO2 in these already established power plant sites might prove to be difficult because how the cities have been expanded. For example, when we first built our power plants and the sites in the district heating network, we didn't have any neighbors close to it, and now it's packed with apartment buildings right next to the sites. So it's not that simple to just have the utilization hub next to the power plant. So it does require some efforts in the infrastructure in the region. Of course, also the site requirements for the electricity grid, water, these all needs to be solved. So we see that the solution would be these CO2 hubs joined with the hydrogen hubs close to the district heating networks, because this would allow the utilization of these high seasonality CO2 sources, but also then the capture of the waste heat back to the district heating network, which would improve the efficiency of these plants, but as mentioned earlier, also create value for the energy companies to participate in this. And of course, hubs could play a key role in reducing the costs, addressing these seasonality challenges, but also mitigating risks related to some inconsistent CO2 flows. And for Tampere and Energia, we see that developing this infrastructure both locally and then nationally would benefit the capturing of the CO2. And it's very key aspects in developing these projects forward. But we do feel optimistic that this will now, with the right infrastructure and policy support, move forward to the implementation phases also in Tampere. I think that's my comments.
Thank you, Pinja. I can tell that you have been very much involved in the project, and you have been thinking about these issues quite deeply. And thank you for the great commentary and also active participation in the project altogether. There is a question for you in the chat, but considering the time, I think I will take Elina here next to give her commentary, and let's see if we have time left after that. And then, but if not, then please, if you could Pinja, answer to the question via chat. But now, Elina Mäki, R&DI project manager from Gas Grid Hydrogen Grids. Go ahead, Elina.
Yes, hi all. And first of all, thanks to VTT for the very informative presentation that was great and I think useful for all of us. And then also thanks to Erika for really great coordination efforts for this whole study. By the way, can you see the slides I'm sharing?
Yes.
Okay, great. So my name is Elina Mäki. I work at Gas Grid as RDI project manager. And I will first say some words about Gas Grid, just in case that it's not familiar to all of you from before. And then I will share some ideas or thoughts, not directly about the report, but rather sparked by that, and a bit more like going beyond the report or the study, some ideas on how the actual implementation could look like of this kind of infrastructure, or what it requires. So Gas Grid is the national transmission system operator for gas. So in other words, we are responsible for the gas transmission and the transmission system in Finland. And now I'm talking about the pipeline transmission. And today the gas that we are transmitting is mostly natural gas, also increasingly biomethane, and in the future we can also connect synthetic methane to the same infrastructure. However, according to our strategy, we are developing multi-gas platform, so we are not excluding any potential gases from the system. And we think that this multi-gas platform is one key element to support the green transition and for example the security of supply in Finland. And today we are already developing the national hydrogen infrastructure, which was already mentioned by Pinja, and also the cross-border infrastructure together with our international partners. And this is done according to task that was given by the Finnish government to Gas Grid. So we see that hydrogen will be one important part of the future transmission system, and it's also one key element of our multi-gas platform. So coming to my first point on this slide, we see that the transmission infrastructures can create benefits and value for the whole, let's call it energy and material system, and also for the whole society. If we take the hydrogen infrastructure as an example, we see that it will enable us to harness the full potential of the Finnish great resource potential in renewable energy, but at the same time it also creates flexibility for the system and also for the market participants to act on different markets, because we have very sector coupled system in the future in Finland. And all in all, we have very good preconditions for the hydrogen economy development in Finland. So we have good renewable energy resources. In European scale, we have rather low cost electricity. And also we have quite strong power grid, where is potential to add more capacity in the future. But then if we look in the value chains, and if we don't want to end the hydrogen value chains to pour hydrogen, what we need is a lot of CO2, and especially biogenic CO2. And as the study shows, we have quite great potential in Finland. I think we can all agree on that. So the CO2 is there, and the potential is good. But then if we start thinking about the implementation of the infrastructure, what we need is realistic view on the future development. So basically this means like real indications from the stakeholders on the locations as well as volumes of CO2 supply and demand and their timely development, and also what are the actual transmission demands. So this can vary between the CCS and CCU pathways. And then I would also like to pose the open question about the timely stability of the CO2 resources. So if we think about infrastructures, they are, as we already heard, they are quite big investments. So if we invest in the infrastructure, we also need to make sure that there is use for the infrastructure in the coming decades in the future. And this actually brings us to the next point. So about national strategy. So I think that it would be very beneficial also from the infrastructure development point of view to have a very clear and comprehensive national strategy which would consider both the CCS and CCU pathways separately, but of course in an aligned manner. So that would kind of give us signs or guidelines for the future development and help the infrastructure planning. But of course, we cannot do that in isolation in Finland. So as it has been already talked, we have to also see what's happening in EU, what's the EU-wide perspective on this. To me, it seems that the discussion on fossil CCS in EU is gaining more and more momentum. So it's also good to consider what does that mean for us in Finland, because we are in a bit different situation with our really great asset in biogenic CO2 resources. And then as a last point, I would like to underline the potential benefits of co-development of infrastructure, so meaning carbon dioxide, hydrogen and electricity infrastructures. That has been also mentioned already quite many times here. But if we want to go for an optimum and efficient total system, it would be good to do this development work in a coordinated manner. And Pinja already mentioned regional optimization regarding the infrastructure, so I can only agree on that. So if we develop these infrastructures in coordinated manner, I think we can really make best out of our great resources. The CO2 transmission and infrastructures in general haven't been discussed so much before, so I think that this report really provides a good starting point for this discussion. So thanks for this study. That was my part. Thank you.
Thank you, Elina, for the great commentary and also active participation in the project. We have a question in the chat. I think we have 3 minutes. So one question is, as a conclusion, what do you consider we should start doing if we would start tomorrow? I guess this is a question, is it for Elina or for all? And then we have a question for Elina. Has it been considered to have CH4, CO2 and H2 fed to the same grid? It would be up to the consumer to separate what they need and the feed the rest of the grid to the grid. I think there's maybe Elina, you can answer to this last question in the chat, as I think we are running out of time. So at this point, unfortunately, I don't think we have a huge time for the discussion, but I'm very glad that the discussion on the chat side has been very active, and we will definitely go through the questions and try to answer if there's anything that we've missed. And just before we end, once again, I would like to thank Lauri and Onni for the good work with this report, and the whole steering group for the excellent work in guiding us through this project. And like Elina mentioned, this is a good starting point for the further developments and discussions, and hopefully this will give you some food for thought, and we will work on this infrastructure development and also the strategic development on the national level together. Right now, I don't think we will take any more questions, but let's continue the discussions via the chat. And as I mentioned, you will receive the materials and the recording afterwards. Now, I have to say goodbye and thank you for joining us today. And in case this is a topic that you're interested in and want to learn more of what's going on in Finland, feel free to contact me whenever, and let's talk more. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone, and have a great weekend.
Have
Thank you
a
very much.
really nice weekend, you all.
Thank you.